front line of policing is loud, but the voices behind it, they're a lot louder and I think, frankly, a lot more interesting. Hi, I'm Bob Plaschke, and this is First Response. This is the number one podcast that takes you behind the badge and uncovers real stories and experiences of first responders from all walks of life and the topics that shape public safety today. If you're curious about the guy or the gal behind the hero, and they are indeed truly heroes, and the topics that they care about, take a listen. This is kind of your front row seat to hearing some of the really interesting voices out there, and more importantly, the heroes. This podcast is sponsored by Pepperball, where I have the honor to serve as CEO. Pepperball creates non-lethal alternatives to guns police use to keep themselves and the public safe. Today, I'm excited to be joined by what I consider a friend and a real significant presence in policing over the last 30 years. Assistant Chief of Police, now retired, Ed Wessing, spent 30 years at Mesa, Arizona. And Mesa is one of the top 100 police agencies in the United States, located right next to Phoenix. Chief Wessing joined Mesa coming out of 8 years of the Marines serving his country, and then transitioned into what many folks from the Marines and from the armed forces do, transition into policing. Into, if they were protecting us outside the borders, it's protecting us kind of inside, so to speak, and inside Mesa. He spent 30 years working up his way up through the ranks at Mesa, was for many years the police information officer, PIO, and which is the kind of the spokesperson to the community to try to explain what policing is and how to develop good relationships with the community, and then worked his way up to being assistant chief up until retiring just a few months ago. Chief Wessing and I have had a chance to meet and work together, and just a real great example of what I think of as policing and the leadership in the United States and police in the United States. So, Chief Wessing, and if you don't mind if I call you Ed, given that we've known each other for so long, thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining. And the first question for you is, how does it feel to be retired? It's now 4 months.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Bob. First of all, I appreciate the time we have spent together. You really do have a good team surrounding you as well, with those that I've met from Pepperball. It's the first couple months are just a time to relax and spend some time with my family. And there's been many days where I'm wondering why my phone's not, going off in the middle of the night. And you get these phantom vibrations from your phone always going off all the time. And you realize I don't have to carry two phones around anymore. Then you realize pretty quickly how much the job really takes from you over time, and not just you personally, but also from your family, because now you're engaged, and when you're here, you're really here. More often than not, even when I was spending time with family and vacations, your mind is always on, hey, is everyone okay at work? Are we doing what we need to be doing? Did we do everything the right way? And now you can be more focused on things that matter in your personal life, which unfortunately sometimes I didn't always pay as much attention as I should have because I focused more on the job. So in that respect, it's feeling good.
Oh, I'm glad for your wife. But it immediately raises the point that, unlike every other job I can think of, minus being a firefighter or an EMS, you are in a constant, not state of anxiety, but you are the stakes are high, and any given moment, something significant can happen. One of your officers can be involved in a shooting. There could be a serious crime or a situation, and that not only can it happen daily, it kind of does happen daily. And so when the phone rings, and as I understand it from police, when they have to call the chief, it is something significant and something serious, and serious not in the context of, hey, I lost that customer, or I didn't get that deal, or the software didn't work. It's someone's life on the line when that phone call comes.
Yeah, I knew when the phone went off in the middle of the night. We unfortunately were involved in a critical incident. One of my officers possibly was injured in a collision or something like that, or some significant community event that we knew we were going to be gone for the next 12 to 24 hours dealing with. And so you knew immediately, all right, if the phone's ringing, I'm getting my uniform on and we're heading out the door pretty quickly thereafter.
How long? And maybe you never get used to it. I mean, the notion that someone we would call and tell you that someone's lost their life, whether it be an officer in the worst case, or it's always worst case if anyone loses their life, but the notion of the significance of those events, did that take you some time to get used to, or do you ever get used to it?
I don't know if you get used to it, but you learn ways to cope and deal with it because, going back to being in the military, you really, you have a sense of purpose, and the mission is more important than your personal feelings on the issue. And you understand immediately the impact that whatever happened has not only on maybe a community member or a whole community, but also the men and women that are entrusted to you. And so you quickly switch to how this is impacting me, to how am I going to positively impact this event for those that were actually doing the job that we asked them to do. And so for me, that the way I dealt with it is by immersing myself in how do I make this event better for not only our officers and our civilian staff that worked on these events, but also those in the community. And quite honestly, I think that's the way most law enforcement officers are wired, and that's how they cope with a lot of these things because they're doing it in the perspective of service and to the community that they took an oath to serve. And then you deal with the after effects after the incident. And for me, I had a lot of personal outlets, whether it be fitness activities or spending time on the golf course, or my outlet was always music. And I was able to cope with a lot of those stresses, for so long. Unfortunately, as we've seen, and with wellness related to first responders, it's been a challenge across the country for many.
It is. I think, unfortunately, the suicide rate amongst police officers is 4 or 5 times higher than the average suicide rate for the normal citizen. And it completely makes sense given the amount of trauma that one experiences, or at least from what you and others have told me, experience. I love the way that you talk about the mission, though, that in effect, the mission is you keep the eye on the ball, and the mission is what you focus on, and that you and the people that you work with are there to keep the community safe. And you know what? That job doesn't go away. Almost that job is omnipresent. It never goes away. Almost independent of what happens, you have to kind of step back up and kind of fight through it. And I think that's that's why I love serving this community. It's that you put the mission and the community first.
Yeah, certainly that should be always our focus. And, at times you get cynical in your career, and, it's always important to set as one of your cultural focus points in your organization is to remember our purpose is to serve the community. And so particularly in this last decade, as things have changed socially, the importance of building relationships with the community are so important, so that when there is tragedy, there is a crisis, you've already got established relationships with the affected communities in the cities or states that you serve. And, we're doing a lot better today than we were 30 years ago in that respect, for sure.
Well, talk about that. I mean, you can now, after a few months retired, you can look back. How has policing changed from the perspective of how the community maybe treated you when you were first on the job to kind of over the last 30 years, and then how you've and your colleagues look at the job?
Boy, that's a tough question to answer because it's really generational. And if you look at some of the biggest changes, I mean, obviously we could talk about technology and how when I started, we didn't even have email. We had a small data terminal in our car that was about 3 inches, and now our officers have fully functional computers in their car. It's body worn cameras. I mean, all these technological tools that they have, and this younger generation, they come into this job and they're already programmed in a sense of being accepting of that technology, where some of your older generational cops it's much more of a difficult transition, because I'm sure you've heard this, but cops hate change, but they also demand change at the same time. But if we go back to community engagement, I can remember 20 years ago, if you'd have asked me as a patrol officer what that meant, none of us would have been able to give you a straight answer. Because we were more focused on the broken windows philosophy of community policing. There really wasn't a true direction on how do we build relationships. And then we started to see that change in the early 2000s, where we started to develop actual relationships and develop protocols on what's expected of every individual in the organization. Because every time you contact somebody, it's an opportunity to put a little bit of that goodwill that you've developed into that bank of community trust. And you're hoping that through instilling good community policing strategies, that you're filling that bank of good trust, because inevitably something bad is going to happen. And if you haven't established those relationships, your community is going to struggle through that period. And I got to be honest with you, we even now have an expectation where our patrol officers are getting credit for spending time with the community. You see, 20 years ago, you got credit for how many arrests you had, how many citations you wrote, how many reports you wrote, how many backups, how many warrants. And those are all good metrics. But we knew that our officers were spending quality time with community, whether it's stopping in one of our impoverished communities and playing basketball with some kids in the park, whether it's working with some of the business community or the religious community, but they weren't even getting credit for it. So we've really changed that paradigm. And once you start to incentivize that type of performance, it really, I think, started to blossom. And so you can never lose focus on reducing crime and relentlessly pursuing criminals. But there has to be a focus on connecting with the community. And I think that's changed significantly over the past 20 years. And the community expectations of that have changed in the last 20 years. I think that's one of the most significant changes, is what the community expects from their policing efforts, whether you're city, county, state, or federal.
I'm going to ask you two questions. The one question I've never had the courage to ask a police officer, so and it's an easy one. And then the second, so the first is, where does the name COPS come from? And then the second question then is, explain the broken window philosophy. I've heard that in relation to New York and NYPD, but I didn't think it was well, explain what it means.
Yeah, well, COPS actually comes from a historical policing where it really goes back to the days of coppers in the UK. Their badges were made out of copper. And so that moniker has really stayed with law enforcement.
My gosh.
Yeah, we're police officers, but the name cop has stood, in whether it's in entertainment, TVs, movies, books, but it really goes back to the early days of policing, both in the UK, but also at the early days here. If you picture, a lot of the cops in New York back in the day in the 1800s, they were coppers.
Right.
And it really started with the material that was used in their badge.
I
And
knew, by
it's
the way, Ed, I knew you'd have that answer. I didn't, by the way, for the folks that listen to this, I didn't tell Ed I was going to ask this. But he was the one guy I felt comfortable enough that I could ask that question. I've always wanted to know. So thank you.
and honestly, it's been my experience that police officers don't mind being called a cop, and some people want to be more respectful, and we appreciate that. But for the most part, that's certainly not a way of calling us that we find to be disrespectful. So
That's also good to know because I've talked to my children about, hey, I want to go talk to that cop. I'm like, you can go talk to that police officer, not that. But is that true as well? So if I said, let me, how do you like being a cop to a normal police officer, they wouldn't take it offensively.
No.
That's good to know. Okay. Now it's back to the broken windows discussion.
Yeah. So really there was a book that was written, and I don't have the author. I should remember this. And Bill Bratton, who was the commissioner of the NYPD, really espoused this theory in the 80s and 90s to really help deal with a lot of the crime that was happening in communities. And in a nutshell, is if you ignore quality of life crimes and just let them to grow and rampant, then that's going to lead to more serious crimes, whether it's property crimes, violent crimes, and of course the most heinous, obviously murders of the like. And so there was a focus on if you see criminal damage, i.e., a broken window. Some cities back then were just ignoring it. And where did we see that predominantly? It was in really impoverished, economically impoverished parts of the community, and there was a lack of police presence, which then led to what we believe is a serious uptick in violent crime. And so, one of the methods of dealing with that is going in and really starting to deal with even the low-level petty crimes that otherwise were just ignored in hopes of impacting the most serious crimes on the back end. And that was really the foundational component of community policing for several decades. In many areas from across the country, it really started right there in the Northeast area that came across the entire country. And we were a part of that phenomenon as well.
And so, what would you do if you saw a broken window? Would you give the owner a citation for not fixing it, or no, how do you address it?
No, I mean, obviously, it's not the owner who is the victim. It's really enforcing, whether it's, vice crimes, prostitution. So it's not just that it's all of those low level crimes. They just termed it the broken windows theory. That you would enforce, that some people would say, hey, they're very minor. Why are we investing so much time? Well, we do believe that by reducing or enforcing those crimes, that you're going to impact, violent crime throughout that community. Maybe it's your presence, and maybe it's your developing relationships. And then we started to include in that theory is let's start solving some of these long-term community problems. If there's blight in a neighborhood, how do we connect services from within the city to pick up the trash, to change the lighting so that there's well-lit streets? It's all that goes into that broken windows theory of addressing issues, so you have some long-term resolution. So sometimes it's not even based on a crime.
Well, it doesn't sound like a bad thing. So why has it fallen out of favor, or has it fallen out of favor?
No, I do believe that there's still there's remnants of that. We don't really call it that anymore. And certainly, if you look in history, there's probably some areas that turned a zero tolerance policy in a lot of these lower level crimes that sometimes the community did not appreciate. What I think is different today is that we try to work with the community and bring the community together to be part of the solution. And certainly there's still going to be enforcement of crimes, but not only are we working better with the city that you work for, and because the police department doesn't have all the tools to solve that. We're not transportation. We can't fix potholes. We can't fix street lights. We can't bring out dumpsters to help communities, repair those issues. And by bringing the community together, then you start to bring them into the fold as there are eyes and ears. We can never be successful truly in a community unless they're willing to call and report crimes And then when an officer gets there, they have to be willing to speak to them, to be a good witness, if they're a witness of a crime. And that's really, I think, where we do a much better job today. Is it's not just focused on those crimes; it's focused on the whole community, and that's really where community policing, I think, has really evolved over the past 20 years.
Oh, that makes sense. So you still focus on getting out ahead. Give them an inch, give them a mile context. So
Right.
so let keep focus even on the small crimes, but do it in conjunction with and with cooperation from and support from the local community by spending more time in upfront education and ongoing outreach.
That's correct. And I'll give you a quick example of, obviously the homeless crisis has been on everybody's mind for the past 5 or 6 years. And so you can't really arrest your way out of the problem. And so what we've done here in Mesa, but also in other cities, is you work within the court system to have some different type of court process. And we have these community courts that specifically deal with people that are experiencing homelessness. And they give them options outside the criminal justice system to resolve their issue and give them access to resources and services needed to hopefully not be in that situation in the future. You wouldn't have heard of that 20 years ago. It would have just been a citation for trespassing, whatever the case is, and then we moved on to the next individual.
Now that brings up another area that must have changed over the last 30 years, and that is the nature of the types of incidents that police respond to. At least what I've heard is the amount of what you would call societal issues, not crimes by their definition, but things that impact the public order have risen dramatically over the last 30 years. Is that a fair statement or oversight?
Yeah, I think where I've seen the change, and the one that I think most impacts police officers and troopers, is dealing with people with mental illness or that are in some type of serious mental crisis. We certainly had issues, 30, 20 years ago, but I don't recall it being as prevalent then as it is today. And I think the community expectations sometimes are unfair for these young officers that are trying to work through these issues with dealing with people in crisis. And unfortunately, it ends up falling on your first responders, police and fire, to deal with those at a much greater level than, back even when I started. And, it just seems like when the states started to push people out of, state services, they just pushed them out into the communities. And then you add in drug components and addictive behavior with mental illness. It's the least favorite call for most officers to deal with today, because now everything's also captured on body-worn camera video. And, the last thing, any officer wants to do is to have to use any level of force on someone who truly is in a mental crisis. It's very challenging for these young officers today, much more so than when I began my career.
Well, and I think that I was in Washington County, right outside of St. Paul, and the sheriff there indicated he thought that the majority of call-outs now were either mental crisis, mental illness, or drug or alcohol addiction. And to your point, when he joined, he kind of joined to keep the public safe, to go chase bad guys, right, to get criminals off the street. And not that he's not sympathetic, but he and his in his age didn't join to deal with didn't expect to deal with these kinds of issues.
Yeah, and I certainly, I don't know what their experience is, and I can say for us here, it's not the majority of the calls that we go on. There's always, particularly violent crime, could be a component of drugs, and gang activity, but it's not the majority of what our folks are doing. But it certainly has seriously uptick over the past 10, 12, 15 years.
Speaking of two more topics, the first is this next generation of police officers. If you think about who you were and why you joined, and the kind of the satisfaction or the things that you appreciated about the job 30 years ago. How does that compare to why someone would join today, what they would expect and what they would experience?
Yeah, I had the pleasure the last 3.5 years to be over our hiring, recruiting, and training efforts. So I got an opportunity to really get to know some of these young people that are signing up for this job today. Which, if you just watch social media, you ask, a young person, why would you do this? Um, and
That's great.
post George Floyd murder, we really had challenges across the country
Right.
in recruiting individuals into this organization or the field of law enforcement in general. And to be honest with you, when you really talk to the people that show up, they want to do the same thing that we did. And we ask them to tell us, why are you here? Like, why? And they all say the same thing that we said 30 years ago. I want to serve my community. I want to do or be part of an honorable profession that serves others. And some of them have very personal stories about why they want to be in law enforcement. I want to catch bad guys because somebody was victimized in my family and I was negatively impacted by that. Or I had such a positive experience with law enforcement. We have had several people that come in and comes from very poor, just difficult backgrounds, and they had a positive influence or positive contact, and they knew that's what they wanted to do. And so I think the initial reason is the same. I will say, our young people today are smarter and more agile than we were 30 years ago. I think the challenge is going to be, as we look at this landscape of finances with pensions, that's changed, where it's not as, what shall I say, as beneficial to get into a pension system as a law enforcement officer. And now it's not even, in some cases, 20 years. Here in Arizona, it's 25 years. And then there's limits on when you can draw, and that's, I think, going to be a challenge for law enforcement moving into the future. But what they do differently, and again, I remember when I was a young cop, the old timers saying, these young cops, they don't understand, and fill in the blanks, whatever we were talking about. Well, we're doing that now. The difference is, I think, where we just blindly followed the rules and we worked hard and we didn't take time off because we didn't earn it yet. We had to earn your respect. Young people today, they really want a better work-life balance, and they are more open to wellness and taking care of themselves for the long term and taking care of their families. Where I think 30 years ago, a lot of young officers came in and they made the job their priority. And I have seen a switch in the last 5 to 7 years with this newer generation of police officers.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, and that's healthy. But I think that's probably, if you look back, when you and I both started our careers, that's what your parents told you. You said, you make the job the priority, and you were making a living for your family, and that came first. I think, though, with policing, the amount of emotional distress and the amount of emotional shock that officers go through, it must be it must be a good thing that they are focused on their wellness and they're open to the proactively dealing with the psychological impact of what a police officer has to deal with.
I think a big difference, Bob, is when I started, the only thing I knew about policing was what I saw on TV and the movies. Now they're inundated with videos and social media all the time. And so they really have already been inundated with what people are actually doing in the job. And so hopefully organizations like ours here in Arizona are focusing on wellness from day one. And it's okay not to be okay. And we are going to provide services or resources, practices to help you be healthy, physical, spiritual, emotional, so that you can have a successful and safe career, not only on the job, but also when you're not on the job anymore. I mean, and if agencies are not making that a focus, they're making a mistake.
Well, and the people I talk to on this podcast, and I talk to in my work at Pepperball, I don't think I've ever run into a chief or a sheriff that hasn't made that a priority. To your point, that's that time, the time to the not the time, but the thematically, I feel like policing in the United States has wholeheartedly embraced mental wellness and the impacts of the traumas that police officers deal with, daily, if not, and the cumulative effects. And so I think that's actually one of the most positives. I think another positive is the quality of training. I would imagine that, and to your point, the technology that officers have now, so that they can make much smarter decisions and do their jobs better. I mean, maybe speak to that. I assume that's changed as well.
Oh, significantly. Like, you would laugh if you saw, we used to have this machine called a Milo Fats machine, and it's where it was basically a video. And, this videos of guys and gals from the 80s, and, you're shooting at the screen. It was so corny. And, but it met a standard that you had to have a decision shoot. Where today we have like a 280-degree, fully immersive simulator with audio and video where we can craft real scenarios and even implement some of our own scenarios. The tools that officers are actually using, you can put in, whether it's rifles, shotguns, and less lethal, non-lethal tools into the scenarios. And then it captures video. And then, you're debriefing after each one of these and getting them to think about, maybe we should consider this in the future. It's about, reassessing what's not working instead of just getting stuck in that, what we used to call the OODA loop, where you just do the same thing over and over again, is to, use time, distance, and cover, and use the tools that you have. I can tell you, training 20 years ago, there was always, I should say always, but a lot of time there was almost somewhat of a punitive or negative connotation to being sent to training. So we wanted to change that to make it a positive experience. And what we're starting to see is, with that change, is you have officers in the field that have their body worn camera. And if they trust their trainers, they're reaching out to them saying, "Hey, officer, can you take a look at this? Tell me how I could have done better."
Wow.
I mean, that's a drastic difference. And I think from a cultural perspective, it's extremely important that even your frontline officers are looking at ways to be better. How can we improve? And it's okay to not be perfect, because perfection is rare that you're ever going to get there. But you should always be striving to be as effective as you can be, and that's been a big change in training.
By the way, as you know, Ed, you guys were kind enough to invite me into your training center, and I participated in that 270-degree experience, and it was phenomenal. I didn't do very well. I think I got a failing grade, but the to your point, it was absolutely real life, or as real life as you could make it, and that kind of technology. I mean, you talk about virtual reality. That's a really good example of the taxpayers' money going to have young officers ready for what they might face out in the street.
Yeah, and you're starting to see more virtual reality headsets coming into training, and so there's a lot of companies working on perfecting that. And to your point, when we host our citizen, police academies and our, citizen events, we include that as a portion of their training, and they always come back with just a better perspective of how difficult it is for our officers to deal with a rapidly evolving, dangerous situation, and they're shooting people that they shouldn't be, and it helps them appreciate, the amazing work that our officers do every day.
You, as in your public information officer role, you've dealt with the public for many years. You were on the front line trying to explain what happened and why. What would you say are the three biggest misconceptions that a layman or a civilian like myself would have about policing?
Oh, that's a good one. I think, when you see these really difficult, incidents where force is being used, that, sometimes cops are portrayed as, that they're looking for that type of incident to happen. And I can tell you from both personal experience as an officer throughout my career, we don't want to get involved in those situations. We do want people to comply with lawful orders. Um, and so sometimes you're unfairly characterized. And we've heard the rhetoric, and you just have to let it shake off and roll off your back. Particularly, with those dealing with mental illness. We've lost a lot of officers, to stress-related injuries. Because when we deal with people, it's always on the worst moment of their life.
Yep.
And so these men and women are husbands and wives, they have kids, and their kids are in school. They're just like you and every one of us in the community. And they want to go home at night, and they want the same things for the family as you do. And I think that's a misconception, is that it's an us against them. No, we are you. We are part of the community. And I can tell you, from seeing too many innocent children deaths, whether by drowning or abuse, you see the impact on mothers and fathers who have kids. My own experience, I can remember, doing CPR on a 2-month-old baby, and it was the same age as my daughter.
Oh,
That call stuck with me, the smell of the child, for 20 years,
okay.
and the impact that has, because we're human beings and we hurt just like everybody else does, but we have a job to do. And hopefully we're able to rise above that. And like I mentioned early on, is complete the objective, or solve the problem, or make things safe, or bring justice to a victim, whatever that incident was. But I think that's a big misnomer, that these are just heartless, calloused individuals. They really are not. They're good human beings in a noble profession that really aren't thanked enough for what they do on a day-to-day basis.
Amen to that, brother. You talk about and you and I you had never shared this CPR issue with the 2-month-old. I think the statistics say that police officers will have somewhere in a 20 to 30 year career, 50 to 60 to 70 of those experiences. When any of us as a civilian, in a worst case, might have 4 or 5 of those experiences. It's the cumulative impact is, I think, just enormous. And to your point, I think that's lost because the public only sees. I think they see officers in their worst day, right? When they see them on film, and they don't see the thousands and thousands of times when they are helping somebody else in their worst day, and doing the to your point, that honorable thing, of which I completely agree is simply deserves a thank you. On that note, by the way, this is in the context of thank you. I have one last. God, I hate to finish up here, but I have one last question for you, and that is to say thank you for joining the Frontline, and the First Response podcast, to make a donation in your name and in a charity of your choice. And what would that be?
That would be the Arizona Disabled Sports Group in Mesa, Arizona, that provides sporting and adaptive opportunities for people of all different types of abilities, veterans. It's our motto is let no one sit on the sidelines, and it really does an amazing work for people who would otherwise not be able to participate in sporting opportunities.
Well, fantastic. Well, Ed, and I'll say Chief Wessing, thank you so much, and for taking the time to be with us. As I leave the chief and finish up the podcast, I reflect on this conversation. It came at a good time. I had a tough day today at work, and a little bit needed a pick me up. And Chief Wessing's the description of how policing is, I think, evolving for in a positive way. He talked about the next generation who is better equipped to handle their mental wellness, who is more open to taking feedback, who expects and wants to leverage technology, and they're still coming in for all the right reasons, and that is to serve the public, to be a service to their community. So I walk away today feeling a bit more positive about the future than I did walking in. So again, folks, thanks for taking the time to listen. And you have been listening to First Response. This is the number one, I hope, podcast that takes you behind the badge of the everyday police officer, in this case, police chief, and to hear their real life stories and experiences. Just impressive, humbling, and fascinating. So wrapping up, again, you've been listening and hopefully enjoyed listening to me. My name is Bob Plaschke, and this is First Response. It is a podcast dedicated to understanding the stories behind the people that wear a badge, who the very brave first responders, more than 1 million out there in the United States. And I am very privileged that this is sponsored by Pepperball, the company that I have the honor to be the CEO of. And again, Pepperball, we deploy non-lethal tools that allow police officers to do their jobs, but not have to use their guns and not have to suffer and keep themselves and the public that they serve safe. Until next time, appreciate it and be safe out there.